Palace of Westminster, the President of my mother's country, my lords, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. President Reagan.
Optimism comes less easily today, not because democracy is less vigorous, but because democracy's enemies have refined their instruments of repression. Yet optimism is in order, because day by day, democracy is proving itself to be a not at all fragile flower. From Stettin on the Baltic to Varna on the Black Sea, the regimes planted by totalitarianism have had more than 30 years to establish their legitimacy. But none, not one regime, has yet been able to risk free elections.
Hello, and welcome to our latest episode of Horns of a Dilemma. My name is Will Inboden, Executive Director of the Clements Center for National Security at the University of Texas at Austin, and also Editor-in-Chief of the Texas National Security Review. And I'm joined today by my longtime friend and colleague and sometime partner in crime as well, Rachel Hoff, the Policy Director for the Ronald Reagan Institute. So Rachel, great to have you with us today.
Thanks for having me on. Great to be here.
No one better to tell us more about the actual meaning of this speech and to appreciate what he was trying to get across than Rachel Hoff. So, Rachel, before we dive into the speech itself, now that we appreciate a little bit more about the difficulties of the time, tell us some about your own background and how you arrived at your current role with the Reagan Institute.
Sure. Thanks so much, Will. Well, the most important part of my background or item in my bio is that the time that I spent at the University of Texas. I'm a proud graduate of the LBJ School, where I got my master's in global policy studies and studied under the great Dr. Inboden, both Drs. Inboden, actually, during my time there, and was proud also to work at the Clements Center during its inception in those early stages.
We call you a plank holder, Rachel, from the Clements Center, because you were part of that very first cohort, and that's why it's so fun to still be working with you these many years later.
Truly my privilege. Yeah. And other than those 2 years that I spent in Austin, I've spent all of my adult life in Washington, D.C. I've worked in the policy space, both at think tanks, focusing on national security and foreign policy issues. And then I've done 2 stints on Capitol Hill, serving more than a decade ago as a legislative assistant for a member of Congress from Texas, Mac Thornberry, who went on to be chair of the House Armed Services Committee, and then more recently serving in the Senate for John McCain. I worked for Senator McCain in his role as chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee and served as his speechwriter and communications director for his work related to national security, defense, and foreign policy. And since that time, I've been working here at the Ronald Reagan Institute for about 3.5 years now. We are, for your listeners, the Washington, D.C. office of the Reagan Presidential Foundation and Library out in California. So we're here as an institute and as the broader foundation and institute as part of the creation of President Reagan to carry on his legacy long after his passing.
Great. Well, thank you. And as I think our listeners picked up, we are certainly very proud to have you as an alum, not just of the University of Texas, but especially the LBJ School and the Clements Center. So it's been great to see you doing such terrific things since then. So we're talking today about the 40th anniversary of President Reagan's iconic Westminster address, which he first delivered on June 8th of 1982. And I'm first going to give a little bit of historical context for the address, and then we're going to turn and get Rachel's reflections on its meaning at the time and its meaning for today. And then she'll tell us a little bit more about a very interesting bipartisan task force and new report that the Reagan Institute has just issued, drawing on the longtime lessons of this speech. So first, to give a little bit of context, when President Reagan first gave this speech in the summer of 1982, it's no exaggeration to say that the world was in crisis. The Western Alliance was being rent asunder by some of the most piercing rifts in 3 decades, really since the dawn of the Cold War. The United States had recently sanctioned our NATO allies over a disputed oil pipeline from the Soviet Union to Western Europe, and also planned to deploy intermediate-range nuclear missiles in NATO nations over fierce resistance from European publics. Again, some resonance with recent trends in our current moment. America and the United Kingdom both remained mired in economic recession, and many citizens were really suffering from runaway inflation, from high unemployment, and questions of whether economic growth could be returned. The Soviet Union, our main adversary, sat at the apex of its military might, had a nuclear arsenal that outmatched that of the United States, and also had overwhelming advantage in many conventional forces, such as ships and tanks and troops. Poland was entering its 6th month in martial law, and there was still the very real concern that the Soviet Union might actually invade to restore and bolster its communist puppet government there. British forces were still fighting and dying in the Falklands Islands as the Falklands War was continuing in their dispute with Argentina. In the East, this is less remembered, but the United States and China were in a tense standoff over Taiwan. And the United States and one of our key allies in the Asia-Pacific, Japan, were also in a tense standoff over trade. So the situation in the Asia-Pacific was also difficult. And then finally, the Middle East. Just 2 days before Reagan's speech, Israel had invaded Lebanon, and really the Middle East had been set aflame again. As for Reagan himself, his own context, when he gave the speech, he'd only been in office less than 18 months. But in that time, he had endured an assassin's bullet, the assassination attempt which very nearly killed him the year before, domestic discord and acrimony, economic trials we mentioned earlier, and turmoil within his own feuding staff. So much so that just a couple of weeks after his speech, he would dismiss his Secretary of State, Al Haig, and then bring in a new Secretary of State. He was already on his second national security advisor. So again, instability within the White House staff. And I'll close this historical introduction on the context. The British ambassador to Washington at the time sent Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, who was Reagan's host for the speech, sent her a confidential cable ahead of the speech as she was preparing to welcome Reagan for his first visit to the UK while in office. And this was the British ambassador's assessment. President Reagan stands lower in the opinion polls than Jimmy Carter did at this period in his presidency, and Reagan risks being written off as a lame duck president 2 years before the end of his first term. So even though we may look back on this speech and appreciate some of its loftier rhetoric and its casting of a more hopeful vision for the future, the world in the Reagan presidency did not feel that way at the time. Nor did he even get a very warm welcome there in London. Over 100,000 protesters flooded Hyde Park, protesting his very visit to the country. It's very controversial. They were denouncing him as a deranged warmonger. And then inside the Palace of Westminster, the Parliament there, more than 200 Labour Party MPs actually boycott his visit and won't even attend the speech. So it's a grim context when he arrives. All right, turning to the speech itself. Again, the Westminster Address is perhaps most remembered for President Reagan's rather arresting prophecy that Marxism-Leninism will end up, quote, on the ash heap of history. But as we're going to be discussing here, there's much more to the speech than just that evocative phrase. Why is it widely regarded as one of his greatest speeches? And if I can even go a little further, not just one of Reagan's greatest speeches, but one of the greatest speeches by any U.S. president in the 20th century?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'd have to agree with that assessment. Perhaps I'm biased here at the Reagan Institute, but I think, without question, it's become one of President Reagan's most notable speeches. I'd point to two different reasons. One, picking up on your point about his declaration of Marxist-Leninism and its future on the ash heap of history, was just sort of the strong rhetoric that came out of the speech. This was something that, of course, President Reagan was known for in many of his speeches as the great communicator. But I think in the Westminster Address, you really see several of those kind of rhetorical flourishes in one sense that are actually that actually have huge ideological and impactful kind of underpinnings to them, that it's not just, lofty rhetoric, but that it comes from a deeply seated view that President Reagan held of the world. And that was that freedom ultimately was the way of the future. And then the second reason that I think the speech has become so prominent is that it was very impactful in terms of policy and in terms of U.S. foreign policy. So coming out of the speech, and maybe we can get at this a little bit later in the conversation, but this is a speech that really made a difference. This is a speech that actually myself as a former speechwriter, I like to talk about, because it's one that had a huge impact in terms of not only the rhetoric, but the policy change that resulted. So back here in Washington, as a result largely of the speech, there was a bipartisan commission that was chartered to figure out how to do what the president had called for in his speech, which was to build a campaign for democracy. Mm-hmm. And that results only 1 year later in the creation of the National Endowment for Democracy, authorized and funded by Congress as an independent organization, and with its affiliated institutes to do the work of promoting democracy and advancing freedom abroad. And so I think there are a few speeches, as you say, among U.S. presidents in the 20th century that had that great of a policy impact. So that would be the second reason I think this one really goes down as so important in history.
Yeah, great. And we're going to come back to both of those themes and unpack them a little more. And it also, I think, bears reinforcing for our listeners that anyone familiar with the craft of presidential speechwriting and speech making knows that these are team efforts. There's a White House speechwriter's office. People whose full-time job are helping craft speeches for the president. In this case, President Reagan was blessed to have one of the greatest White House speechwriters in history, Tony Dolan, working on this one, who was the lead pen on the speechwriter level. But I bring that up because as a couple of scholars, Robert Rowland and John Jones, have demonstrated, who wrote a whole book just in the speech, about 60% of the actual text of the speech was written by Reagan himself. And of course, all of 100% of the ideas in it are his. But they've looked through all the different drafts of the speech in the archives at the Reagan Library, and seen which were Dolan's words and which were Reagan's. And you can see Reagan's handwritten edits there. So this was a speech that Reagan himself devoted weeks of time and energy into. Again, with great help from Tony Dolan, a couple outside consultants, George Will, the venerable columnist, also contributed some to it as well. But I think when we talk about Reagan said this or Reagan said that in the speech, we really are talking about his words and his ideas. This was not just, as there's a unfortunate caricature out there of the former Hollywood actor getting up and just reading a script that someone else put in front of him. I mean, he wrote much of the script himself.
Yeah, and if I can foot stomp that point just a bit, it's not just the edits on the previous drafts of the speech are quite a bit more than sort of wordsmithing, happy to glad here and there, or changing the order of the sections of the speech, or any kind of more traditional what you'd think of in terms of presidential or principal speechwriting edits. As you say, I mean, entire paragraphs in President Reagan's hand, pages at a time, in his handwriting, to improve upon the drafts. And so many of the notable quotes that come out of the speech are from President Reagan's, as you say, not just edits, but real substantive contributions to the heart of the speech.
Yeah. And in turn on that, even as Tony Dolan has said before in interviews and in a recollection he wrote on this, when Dolan produced his first speechwriter's draft of this speech, he had, in order to do that, researched plenty of Reagan's previous writings in the 1970s and other speeches Reagan had given on, critiques of Marxism, Leninism, and support for democracy. So even the speechwriter was in turn drawing on Reagan's own work there before. So again, it's really reinforces at the end of the day, this is Reagan's speech with a strong personal imprint. So back to the speech itself. rereading it today, and again, I know you've reread it and viewed it many, many times. You could probably, memorize it the way students used to memorize the Gettysburg Address or something and deliver it from memory. What most stands out to you? Are there any messages from it, or any particular passages or turns of phrase that you find particularly compelling?
Yeah, there are a couple that I think resonate more than others in terms of the geopolitical events that we see today. One that jumps out to me that is part of President Reagan's own handwritten contributions to the speech, to the previous point, is where he talks about how democracy is not a fragile flower. Mm-hmm. And I think, what we're seeing in Ukraine with democracy and sovereignty and freedom under attack, and the way that the Ukrainian people, not just the Ukrainian military or their leaders, but the average Ukrainians are standing up to defend their freedom and their democracy. Yeah. That line about, this isn't, the democracy itself is not a fragile flower. And then the second half of that sentence, but still it needs cultivating. Mm-hmm. And that really gets to, again, the policy impact of the speech, the role of the United States and indeed the whole free world, the importance of our efforts in standing with the Ukrainians in their fight for freedom and in order to cultivate and protect their own democracy. One other, if I may, quote that I think resonates with a different challenge we face today in terms of China is the line in the speech around democracy's enemies refining their instruments of repression. Yeah. And you, as the historian in this conversation, would be more qualified to tell us what President Reagan meant in 1982, what instruments of repression the authoritarians were refining. But that's one quote that certainly resonates with what we see, especially in China today. Mm-hmm. This isn't Chairman Mao's Chinese Communist Party. It's a rural or undeveloped form of or a system of repression. The CCP and in fact authoritarians from around the world are leveraging new technologies in order to do the business of repressing freedom, of surveilling their people, utilizing artificial intelligence technologies, facial recognition technology, in order to pursue really this 21st century brand of authoritarianism. Mm-hmm. And so that's a part of the speech that I think really resonates today as well.
Yeah, no, again, both, both, very, very powerful parts of the speech. There's certainly that evocative metaphor you described about democracy is not a fragile flower. And again, as we see with Ukrainians, fighting for their own sovereignty, for their self-government, but also it needs cultivating, right? The need for external support, the need for more robust and secure democracies to support those who are imperiled. And if there's a common through line of totalitarianism, it is efforts to monitor and control its own people, whether we saw that with Nazi Germany or Soviet communism and now with communist China. So that's the common theme, but the instruments and methods of it are quite different, keeping pace with technology and other ways that people might, it's kind of a constant struggle between the authoritarian government and trying to control not just what its citizens do, but what they think and say as well. So turning to that's a good segue to another part of the speech I wanted to get your reflections on. And again, one of the central thrusts of the speech is this critique of totalitarianism. And Reagan draws a direct line in the speech from Nazi Germany to Soviet communism. I just want to read two brief but very notable excerpts from the speech to you here, and then get your reflections in these. So first, and this is where Reagan is, self-consciously echoing Churchill's Iron Curtain speech. He says, "From Stettin on the Baltic to Varna on the Black Sea, the regimes planted by totalitarianism have had more than 30 years to establish their legitimacy, but not one regime, has yet been able to risk free elections. Regimes planted by bayonets do not take root." And then the second passage shortly after that one is this: One of the simple but overwhelming facts of our time is this: of all the millions of refugees we've seen in the modern world, their flight is always away from, not toward, the communist world. Today on the NATO line, our military forces face east to prevent a possible invasion. On the other side of the line, the Soviet forces also face east to prevent their people from leaving. Again, both of these, the point about how authoritarian governments can't even risk free elections, regimes planted by bayonets don't take root, but then also how, one, very simple, visceral, gut level test of the condition of a society and its government. Are people trying to get in it or get out of it? Are they trying to leave, or are they trying to arrive? And again, he's got that resting point there. So do these, and he said this in 1982. Those were his critiques of communism in 1982. Do those still resonate today? I mean, do they still apply to the Chinese Communist Party or Putin's Russia or North Korea?
So much in the speech does resonate with today's world. But one thing that we've been thinking a lot about at the Reagan Institute and part of our Westminster 2.0 working group that you referenced earlier, to re-envision, how to think about a Westminster style approach to advancing freedom and democracy in the 21st century, is what's changed. And I don't know if maybe this is sort of quibbling on semantics, but I certainly think that the idea behind President Reagan's assertion that regimes planted by bayonets don't take root, that's everlasting. That will always be true. But one thing that we've noticed that has changed in the last 40 years with regard to how those regimes try to get legitimacy, even though they're fundamentally illegitimate, is that you find a lot of dictators and authoritarians today around the world who will kind of bend the rules of democracy to try to lend themselves legitimacy. So the number of dictators who hold sham elections or they're elected all the time with 100% of the vote. They hint at democracy in a way that wasn't necessarily true in the past. And I think that in a different way shows fundamentally democracy's legitimacy, that this form of government rooted in the consent of the governed is something that even authoritarian or totalitarian dictators have realized, we have to at least pretend that we do this stuff in order to try to lend ourselves some form of legitimacy. So they're not truly doing democracy, obviously, but they're working to bend it toward their own legitimacy.
Yeah. I mean, as I've commented to our students at UT before, it's no accident that North Korea's official name is the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And again, nothing democratic about them in the true sense, but that grasping after the veneer, or at least the legitimacy that the word democratic or the images of democratic processes brings. I know, while we're at, another difference from Reagan's moment and now is there's another part of the speech where he goes into a sustained economic critique of communist regimes and points out how, at least in 1982, they were all impoverished, right? None of them had been able to generate economic dynamism or growth or, increasing living standards for their people. But, one key to the Chinese Communist Party's, ongoing rule and viability has been, starting later in the 1980s, they did figure out how to generate economic growth. And it was partly by adopting some features of capitalism, of course. But, that has been one key to their staying in power. And so, obviously, we can't expect Reagan in 1982 to perfectly envision the future. But that would be, I think, another dissimilarity which has further entrenched the CCP in powers. The economic quality of life for, hundreds of millions of Chinese citizens is demonstrably better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. And part of the working group, which I know we'll get to in a bit as well, was keying in on exactly where those major changes have been in the intervening decades, and then how we need to kind of adjust our own approach in order to continue taking up sort of President Reagan's call to action, but in a way that he himself would have reimagined the speech to align with the realities of today's world, vice 1982.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's turn now to that call to action. Again, you mentioned it in passing further, but it's a chance to tell our listeners a little bit more, because this is one of the really enduring legacies of the speech. And he signals it himself, and I'll read the excerpt from the speech. He says, "The objective I propose is quite simple to state: to foster the infrastructure of democracy, the system of a free press, unions, political parties, universities, which allows the people to choose their own way to develop their own culture, to reconcile their own differences through peaceful means." So what did he mean by that about foster, this crusade for freedom, to use his words, to foster this infrastructure of democracy? Because that was pretty notable at the time.
It was, and it picked up on the threads of policy conversation that were already at work here in Washington, and I think gave voice to them. This is a great example of where the bully pulpit, where the presidential platform matters, where a president can really, move quickly. Mm-hmm. Or inspire the bureaucracy to move quickly, or the Congress to move quickly, when he puts his weight behind an initiative. So that infrastructure of democracy that he talked about to implement this crusade for freedom or campaign for democracy, he talks about, I think importantly, kind of flipping the script a little bit on those who over the Cold War up until 1982 had focused mostly on defending against the advance of communism, containing or preventing the spread of Soviet communism. And his speech, I think, true to President Reagan's more optimistic, proactive approach to most things, was to say we actually need to do the work of advancing freedom and democracy, not just working against the spread of communism and authoritarianism. And so what happens as a result is, as I mentioned, there's a bipartisan commission that looks at how to actually build that infrastructure. They make a recommendation to the U.S. Congress. And by 1983, back when Washington could move quickly on things, just a year after the speech, Congress authorizes and funds the National Endowment for Democracy as the core independent institute to foster this work abroad. And then picking up on that quote that you read, the system of a free press, unions, political parties, universities, there are these affiliated institutes under the National Endowment for Democracy that are meant to implement in their own lane particular aspects of that work. So, of course, the International Republican Institute and the National Democratic Institute, which are loosely affiliated with our domestic political parties in the United States and do political training of foreign political parties and candidates for public office. And then kind of, loosely representing the left and right as well, the Solidarity Institute or sort of the labor union side of the House was loosely affiliated with the AFL-CIO.
Yeah,
and then
I think that was originally, was it the American Center for Labor Solidarity, ASOL, something like that. So yeah, right. Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, they've changed their name over time, and then the Center for International Private Enterprise, loosely affiliated, on the right with the Chamber of Commerce, and so, or kind of traditionally how we think of right and left, at least in the U.S. And so these institutes, since then, really have been doing the work of advancing those particular aspects of democracy. One thing that I think this gets at that is so true of today's world is that democracy is about much more than simply holding free and fair elections. That's important, an important start to any democratic process, and lends that legitimacy that we talked about earlier. But the democracy is about so much more than that, whether it's workers' rights or property rights, private, the fostering of private enterprise, of course, on to protecting religious freedom and the rule of law, and on down the list, of free press and, support for an independent media. That democracy, cannot rest on elections alone. And one of the things that I think is really part of the genius of the Westminster speech and what came after the Westminster speech in terms of building this infrastructure of democracy is that it recognizes that fact and has so many more aspects beyond just free and fair elections.
Yeah, exactly. And in turn, so much more than just the lofty rhetoric of the speech itself. So, and again, I think we can see some real intentionality on Reagan's part there. There's that great phrase at the beginning of the speech. It has been said that an institution is the lengthening shadow of a man. Today we might say, a man or woman, a human being, right? Well, as you just laid out very eloquently, with the speech, Reagan set in motion the creation of these enduring institutions, National Endowment for Democracy, IRI, NDI, and so forth, committed to democracy promotion. And those institutions, in turn, as you just laid out, are committed to helping support and cultivate the institutions of democracy in other countries. Again, so much more than just free and fair elections, but civil society, freedom of the press, religious freedom, property rights, workers' rights, labor rights. Again, this is not a partisan issue at all, but rather is about the functioning institutions of a free society.
Yeah, and one other point that I'd make, just to bridge, off of the great work that these organizations do, is that they've never been about imposing democracy or the heart of their work is really not about the United States at all. It's about supporting and empowering and offering resources and training and support to the freedom fighters around the world who are seeking to create more free and just societies at home. And so there's a great line, there are too many great quotes in the speech for one podcast, but another line that I think really stands out and stands the test of time is when President Reagan talks, kind of takes on maybe his critics. And I think there would be some of these same critics today in terms of the work, who are we to go around the world imposing democracy on others? And President Reagan says that it's not cultural imperialism, but merely a way of providing a means for self-determination and protection of diversity. And actually that what's the worst form of cultural condescension would be to say that any people would prefer to be unfree rather than to be free, to live in a dictatorship rather than a democracy. And so I think President Reagan and how he anticipates that and sort of flips that script as well is a really important part of not just the speech, but the work that the National Endowment for Democracy and its affiliated institutes, and even the U.S. government over time through State Department, USAID, have taken up kind of what is often referred to as democracy promotion, but like we said, is so much more than just the elections piece to advance freedom and to help those fighting for freedom around the world.
Yeah, again, supremely important point. I'm so glad you read that passage, because it was his, as you said, his effort to anticipate or preempt or answer some of the critics. And then, in addition to the eloquent turn of phrase, he cites examples of democratic process in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia at the time, some early seeds that they were seeing, which of course come to flourish over the next decade. Similarly, there's another great line in the speech where he says, "We must be staunch in our conviction that freedom is not the sole prerogative of a lucky few, but the inalienable and universal right of all human beings. So states the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which, among other things, guarantees free elections." Mm-hmm. So again, he grounds this in international norms and institutions such as the UN.
That's right. That quote, by the way, is singularly responsible for my knowing how to spell the word prerogative, which is not what it looks like.
Okay, that's right. So one that we all frequently still choke on and stumble over. So, all right. Well, again, kind of tracing the speech and its consequences forward, he gives us, again, to remind our listeners, in June of 1982, when you were seeing some initial seeds of the growth of democracy around the world, but it still did not seem like it was a democratic way of many means. But tell us about what the next decade or so in world affairs looked like, especially on this question of democracy, kind of from 1982 through the end of the Reagan presidency, but then of course into 1989, 1991, 92. So does he get it right overall as far as his predictions here, or was it hopelessly utopian?
Well, I think even President Reagan would would admit, and he does in the speech, that optimism is at the core of every, of his approach to the issues. But I think it's such an important question to sort of look in the long view at what history held in terms of the advance of freedom following the speech. It's easy to look back and think 1982 is pretty close to 1989, but with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1991 and the end of the Cold War, and of course, as you said, those any kind of hint at the growth of freedom and democracy were but seeds at the time, and it was very much in the middle of the Cold War that President Reagan gives this speech, as you said, just over a year into his presidency. So I think certainly within 10 years of the speech, seeing the fall of the Soviet Union and the Iron Curtain and the Berlin Wall coming down, you see some of the impact, again, not just of the role of the United States in fostering the infrastructure of democracy, but those behind the Iron Curtain fighting for their own freedom and standing up for their own freedom. That's another way in which I think this speech was really important, is how it gave voice and offered support to those living in unfree societies. But one thing that I think is important to point out too, and that maybe speaks a little bit more to the legacy of kind of the trajectory of freedom in more recent years, as we've seen some democratic decline. The Freedom House rankings, their annual Freedom in the World report, show that each of the last 16 years there's been a decline in global freedom.
Yeah, recession they've called it. Yeah.
But President Reagan, I think, hints at some of that in his speech as well. He's optimistic, as I said, as he typically was, but he also talks about not forcing the pace of change. Mm-hmm. And he talks about the gradual growth of freedom and democracy. Mm-hmm. And so I think even, of course, with the real global turning point of the end of the Cold War, just 10 or so years after the speech, I think you see more recently, threads of democratic kind of flatlining or backsliding in many societies that President Reagan, I think, acknowledges in the speech as well. Not that he foresaw any particular circumstance that we're seeing around the world today, but that he understood that this wasn't a linear progress toward freedom, but a gradual growth, as he said.
Yeah, no, and I think there's a more sophisticated engagement with the ebb and flow of history there, if you will, in the speech. Whereas you pointed out, he says that this is often gradual, and a lot of it will be determined by each particular country and society and the peoples therein. And we can, see that looking back over time, as you were describing, where, on the one hand, in the, decade or so after the speech, you see a tremendous flowering of democracy, not just the fall of the Iron Curtain and the democratic transitions in Eastern Europe, but also, in Asia, Taiwan and South Korea and the Philippines go through peaceful democratic transitions, in Latin America, Argentina and Chile and Brazil and, El Salvador. And so it is a good run there. But then more recently, as you pointed out, of our current generation, the last decade and a half have not been so good. And that brings us to the final theme I wanted to talk about today, which is, we can lament this democratic decline, but Stan, you and your colleagues there at the Reagan Institute are trying to do something about it. So tell us more about this Westminster 2.0 task force, this multi-year project that you helped conceive and lead, and the big report that you've released on June 1st.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. So the Reagan Institute, as I mentioned at the beginning, charged with carrying on President Reagan's legacy, and the Institute here in DC in particular, with actively promoting President Reagan's legacy for the 21st century. We do a lot of convening and a lot of bipartisan convening. And one of the ways that we've done that is through, under our Center for Freedom and Democracy, to channel that aspect of President Reagan's legacy, convening this bipartisan working group over the past 2 years, and and publishing now around the 40th anniversary of this important speech, the report of the working group. Westminster 2.0 meant, as we've been discussing, to re-envision, reinvigorate the speech, the approach of the speech for today's world, given the challenges and opportunities we face. You and I have talked today about a lot of those challenges that look similar to the challenges we've faced in the past, but there are also so many ways in which the world today is fundamentally different than 1982. And so the working group was co-chaired by Mark Green and Ken Wallach, the former heads of IRI and NDI. Mm-hmm. And we had a variety of current and former public officials on the working group, leaders from the business and technology sectors, and thought leaders and academics as well. And the report, which your listeners, by the way, can download at reaganfoundation.org/Westminster.
Okay. I'll repeat that for everyone. So it is reaganfoundation.org/Westminster. Okay.
Correct. And the report focuses in on several key themes that are either sort of what the working group settled on as new challenges for the 21st century, or challenges or opportunities that are of kind of renewed importance in today's world compared with 1982. So one is around leveraging new technologies to advance freedom. We talked about the ways that authoritarian regimes leverage these technologies to suppress freedom, and how can we empower dissidents and freedom fighters and democracy activists around the world with the technological tools they need to support their work. Delivering resources to independent voices and civil society activists in new ways, in some ways leveraging the current architecture and infrastructure that we have, and in some ways, creating new avenues for doing that. Thinking third theme about the synergies between anti-corruption efforts and democracy efforts. So how do dictators leverage kleptocracy for their ill intent, and how can we, through transparency and anti-corruption efforts, lean into more of that aspect of democratization. For a theme around invigorating independent media and investigative journalism. So we've seen very recently in Russia how dictators will often simply crush independent media in order to keep the public from true and accurate information. And how can we, in service of expanding freedom, support independent media? And then finally, empowering international cooperation. So the United States, maybe the leader of the free world, but there is a whole free world out there in addition to the United States. And how can our allies and partners, whether they've seen democracy promotion as part of their, a core part of their foreign policy or not, how can we leverage this international architecture that exists? In President Reagan's time, he talked a lot about the West. He talked a lot about the transatlantic alliance, which was how we thought of this during the Cold War. But now, the free world extends much, much further, and there are democratic allies and partners in every region of the world that can and should be a part of these efforts as well.
Terrific. Well, a great overview of a number of the key findings and recommendations of the Westminster 2.0 report. And again, that, as you mentioned, draws on 2 years worth of work and bipartisan expertise. From the co-chairs on down to all the different members, and all much of it quarterbacked by Rachel and her colleagues there at the Reagan Institute. So anyway, I think a fitting topic to close on, as we have reflected on both the historical meaning and context of President Reagan's speech, but also efforts to draw on its insights and update them for the new challenges here in the year 2022. So thanks to all of our listeners. Again, our special guest today has been Rachel Hoff, a woman of many accomplishments and great policy acumen. But as she herself said, her proudest accomplishment is being a graduate of the University of Texas at Austin and a Clement Center alum. And we were, in that respect, especially honored to be hosting you today. So thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.